I had dreamed of flying a plane from a very young age, though that dream had been wiped away by an extreme fear of flying that was realized during my teenage years. However, from time to time, the thought of being able to fly an airplane would creep back into my mind, but it was never anything more than a brief contemplation. Then in August of 2012, Chuck, who is a good friend of mine as well as a commercial airline pilot, rented a small plane to take me for a ride. He knew about my dream to become a pilot as well as about my fear of flying. He also seemed to know that if I were to overcome my fear, I would make a great pilot. The 1-hour flight was both the coolest and most terrifying experience I had lived through in quite some time. I hated any hint of turbulence, and even the slightest bump would paralyze me in my seat. I even feared turning, as turning required banking the plane. The only part that was acceptable was landing, as landing meant that I would soon be on the ground again and be able to relax. In fact, it was probably the only time I truly smiled during the entire flight. Despite how briefly I was able to smile, the experience did give me a glimmer of hope that I'd be able to overcome my fears. I knew that it was going to be a long journey, and also that I would need for things to go as smoothly as possible if I were to stop myself from turning back and giving up. I was fortunate to find a patient and experienced instructor through Chuck, so during a cool evening in late October I had my first lesson with Norm. I was still very hesitant about flying and remained fearful throughout the flight, despite how smooth it was. While returning to the airport to land, I was given control of the yoke while Norm continued to man the power settings and the flaps. Not only did it turn out to be a great first landing, but it was also the moment that the seed in my mind was planted. Winter came soon enough, and the season without flying gave me time to prepare and get my documents ready. I needed to take a medical as well as pass an exam called the P-STAR, which is basically a bunch of rules you need to learn before you fly. In May of 2014, Norm began giving lessons at a small flight school in St. Lazare. When I first went to my new school, I had the impression that I was learning to fly amongst friends instead of at a business. This was great for me, as I was able to relax more and enjoy the experience in such a fun and easygoing atmosphere. I began training at least twice per week. At times I was still too nervous to really take in the information, but at other times I was enjoying it all. I contemplated giving up many times, but always managed to find at least one good thing about each flight to keep me going. I continued to push myself along until I had completed the entire first page of my logbook. In mid-June, Norm told me that I was ready to take my first solo flight. Though that was a great achievement for me, my mind was not able to respond to that statement in a very positive manner. I found it hard to believe that I was ready, but also trusted the judgment and expertise of my instructor. On June 20th, 2014, a Friday evening with no real wind or traffic in the air, the conditions were perfect for me to take off on my own for the first time. Little did I know my friend Chuck was hiding in the bushes in order to help me document this very special event. We started the lesson by doing some regular circuits, and I kept finishing my calls with the words, "touch and go." On the third landing, Norm took control after touchdown and taxied us back to the threshold of the runway. Norm positioned the plane in the proper direction and unbuckled his seatbelt. After gathering his things, he hopped out with a bon voyage and walked out of my sight. Luckily, Chuck continued to capture the images of the big moment. I did a quick takeoff check, made a radio call that I was lining up for runway 20. I taxied onto the runway and pushed the throttle to full power. As I rolled down the runway, I watched the speed increase from 40 to 55, then at 55 I started to pull back and accelerate a bit more. Sometime around this moment, I also realized that I was fully committed in going through with my first solo flight successfully, as turning back was no option at all. The feeling of lifting off the ground with no one beside me for guidance was more empowering than fearful. I was hyper-focused on everything that I had to do, and my mind had no space left for any fear to take hold of me. I turned crosswind, climbed to 1,000 feet, and then turned downwind. I looked out to my left at the field and estimated that there would be about another 3 minutes until I was on the ground. As I throttled back and looked for traffic, I noticed the empty seat beside me, but remained focused on the task at hand. Everything looked great as I turned onto final and adjusted my glide slope accordingly. The excitement grew as I approached the runway and saw little flashes of light from around the airport, as everyone was out now in the open to take pictures of my first solo landing. I floated more while traveling down the runway, but was also used to having the weight of another person in the seat beside me. Right after hearing the chirp of the wheels touching down, I began to truly realize what an amazing feat I had accomplished. I was utterly speechless, but had the biggest smile I could physically produce. I taxied back to the parking area where Norm seemed to be pleased with my performance. I got the plane shut down and opened the door to a bunch of cameras in my face. I was being congratulated and made to feel like some sort of Hollywood star. I was so caught up in the action that I did not realize that a plan to initiate me after my first solo flight was already in motion. While Chuck and Norm were taking photos of me and asking me how I felt about my flight, another guy was already sneaking up behind me with a bucket full of cold water. Norm couldn't have caught a better moment while taking the picture of my thorough drenching. The whole experience was quite overwhelming, and it is a memory that I will cherish and never forget.
Oh, it was incredible. It was amazing. It was something I didn't think I could ever do.